While Miriam's helping coach here, I'll introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Bruce Spencer. And how's that? Yeah? And Bruce works in the Center for Work and Community Studies at Athabasca University. So please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Thanks very much. I'm an adult educator and have been for 40 years. And there's a long tradition of peace activism within adult education, and it's from that tradition that I speak today. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the accusation that's being made about Israel Apartheid Israel Week, that somehow it's anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. Just briefly. I think this is an interesting and it's a problematic charge. We're living in a complex society in which the Pope can, and I'm not a religious person, I should say, in which the Pope can allow Bishop Williamson to be reintegrated into the church, can excuse him for denying that 6 million Jews were slaughtered. It wasn't only Jews, of course, it was Roma, or Gypsies, if you prefer. Jehovah's Witnesses, gays, disabled people, and political opponents, mainly communists, but it was 6 million Jews, and I hope nobody's here is going to deny that. Holocaust denial, of course, is a major problem. The Armenian Holocaust of 1915, in which 1.5 million Armenian Christians died at the hands of the Turks, has been denied and will not be acknowledged by Bush or Robert Gates. Robert Gates is now in the Obama administration. And it's also interesting that Israel's Shimon Peres in April 2001, when he went to Turkey, also denied that Holocaust. So it seems Holocaust denial is something that even Jews engage in when it suits their political purpose. I would add my favourite Holocaust denial, and that, of course, is the US invasion of Vietnam. I'm old enough to remember it. And the bombing of Cambodia. And incidentally, the support of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, which made the news recently because they're going to be tried for their war crimes, but their supporters, which included not only the US, but also the Thatcher government, which lended them a lot of support and tactical support and how to organise their forces. And none of those will be in the dock with the Khmer Rouge. But it was a genocidal war in which 3 million people were killed. The chemical weapons today are still resulting in major birth defects. And we should never forget that. And the US has never paid compensation to the Vietnamese. In fact, quite the reverse. For almost 18 years they operated an embargo. And now, of course, we get to Gaza in the 2000s. Richard Falk, a US Jew and a UN rapporteur on Palestine, writing in 2007, before the recent attack on Gaza, examined the question of whether or not the siege, the occupation, the treatment of the Palestinians could be considered a Holocaust. Now, he wrestled with this question. As a Jew, he certainly did not want to belittle the great evil of the Nazi criminality. But I want to read you the quote to his article. This article, by the way, can be found on ZNet, if you want to look for it. Israel is currently stiffening the boycott on economic relations that has brought the people of Gaza to the brink of collective starvation, Richard Falk wrote. This set of policies, carried on for more than 4 decades, has imposed a subhuman existence on a people that have been repeatedly and systematically made the target of a variety of severe forms of collective punishment. The entire population of Gaza is treated as the enemy of Israel, and little pretext is made in Tel Aviv of acknowledging the innocence of this long victimized civilian society. He concluded by saying, to persist with such an approach under present circumstances is indeed genocidal and risks destroying an entire Palestinian community that is an integral part of an ethnic whole. It is this prospect that makes appropriate the warning of a Palestinian Holocaust. in the making, and should remind the world of the famous post-Nazi pledge of never again. He wrote this in 2007. He wrote this before the recent attack on Gaza. And I just wonder how many people are recognizing this as a Holocaust, as an illegal activity, as a planned and carefully prepared attempt to treat a whole population as somehow guilty of some imagined offences. Do I, or we, reserve the right to criticise Jewish and other supporters of Israel who sends funds to Israel to support the illegal settlement movement, the thievery of Palestinian land? My answer to that would be absolutely. And we should call on the Canadian government to ban such groups and the transfer of such funds. To do so is not anti-Jewish. What we are opposing is the illegal activity of the Israeli state and supporters of that illegal activity. The other question that's been raised is that if we're not anti-Semitic, then we're somehow anti-Israel. And that's another problematic question. Speaking personally, I can support an Israeli state. That is one that is behind 1967 borders, with no more occupations, no more illegal settlements, no more attacks on neighbours. I can support an Israeli state with no discriminatory laws against Palestinians and non-Jews. I can support an Israeli state with refugees having the right to return and compensation. I would prefer an Israeli state that was nuclear free. I would prefer an Israeli state that was not Zionist but was multicultural, multi-ethnic, just like Canada. I mean, is that so difficult to imagine? I mean, it's not really a threat, is it? Now, the Israeli state could either be a two-state solution under the conditions I've just outlined, or a one-country Israel-Palestine. My preference would be the one country, but it's not for me to determine that. It's for the people of the region. I next come to the question of, is Israel an apartheid state? You will have attended some of the other events, probably have heard something about this, but I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge. Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, many Israeli and Jewish commentators agree that Israel is an apartheid state, similar to apartheid South Africa. Jimmy Carter's an interesting character. I've got his most recent book over there. He was recently denounced by an eminent lawyer at Harvard, claiming that Jimmy Carter wasn't anti-Semitic, then he was certainly anti-Israel. If anybody's read Jimmy Carter's books, you could never accuse him of being anti-Israel. He is very much in favour of a peaceful Israel, an Israel that responds to UN resolutions. In fact, he's in favour of a Jewish Israel, which I might have some argument with him about. It can be argued that Israel is a settler society, colonised on the lands of a native people. That many of that population, it's generally accepted that at least 750,000 were driven out in 1948. Their property confiscated, and those that remained were legally segregated. There were a range of laws that allowed for confiscation, acquisition, controlled development. Included zoning, preventing the growth of Arab villages, and promoted the building and extension of Jewish settlements on previous Arab land. The law of return in 1950 favours Jews and excluded native-born Palestinians. The Nationality Citizenship Act of 1952 stated that non-Jews must prove their residency and pass other tests. Citizenship is at the discretion of the ministry. 2003, Palestinian spouses of Israelis were denied citizenship. This is very similar, this range of laws is very similar to apartheid laws in South Africa, for those of you who remember it. I mean, perhaps I just should say that for younger members here, that one of the issues around apartheid in South Africa is it might seem obvious to you now that apartheid should end in South Africa. But 30 years ago, it didn't seem quite so obvious, and I'll come to that in a minute. Population Registry 1965 identifies Jews, Arab Jews. Identity cards were issued, and after 1982, you had to carry those and you had to produce them on demand. There was regulation of political parties in 1992. Only those parties who accepted Israel as a Jewish state were allowed to operate. More important, perhaps, than just the series of legislation was the regulatory practices imposed on Palestinians. Homes were demolished. Checkpoints prevented free movement. Curfews restricted movement. And more than 90% of Palestinian building permits requested are refused. The exact reverse for Jewish applicants, of course. More than 90% are permitted. Different sentences are even handed out to Palestinians and Jews for similar crimes and justified in the Israeli courts on nationality differences. All the emergency regulations give the military a free hand against Palestinians with no rights to challenge military directives. Now, it could be argued that at least the Bantu stands in South Africa were created on land which could support the population to some extent. By contrast, however, I would argue that the enclaves being created for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank do not. You would have recognised from my Canadian accent that I probably know quite a bit about the UK. And I'm going to use the example of the Anti-Apartheid movement in the UK. I've been in Canada nearly 20 years, or 20 winters, as I prefer to count. It's the most distinguishing feature. But looking at the British anti-apartheid, why is the British anti-apartheid so important? Well, because of, you know, as Canadians, you know about the Commonwealth and the relationship between Britain and South Africa, and the importance of trade links. Just as Canada supplied furs and then wheat to Britain, South Africa provided fruits and other goods to Britain. It was a major trading relationship. So the British anti-apartheid movement grew through the 1950s in response to the racist laws passed in South Africa from 1948 on. And many of the ones I've read for Israel could be read for South Africa. By 1959, a boycott movement was beginning. It took time for this to be accepted by major political parties and others in the UK and, of course, the US, with strong opposition to the idea was interfering with the internal affairs of another country. And also, South Africa was seen as a bulwark against communism. That was very popular in the US, of course. Now, it's true that consumer boycotts had some impact, and South Africa's major trade was with the UK. The major impact came, however, with economic and arms boycotts. These demands became more popular from the mid-1960s, but it was not until 1985, as late as 1985, that the economic trade sanctions became effective. Canada was a leading advocate of economic boycotts. Trudeau, you've heard of Trudeau? It's Trudeau, isn't it? Who we credit for much of this activity. And of course, Aotearoa, New Zealand, was very active in the movement. Anybody who knows Aotearoa, New Zealand will know that they're obsessed with, or at least obsessed with rugby and cricket. And South Africa had the same obsession, so the sports boycott was particularly active in there. And it was used as a springboard for their activity. The British anti-apartheid movement was, I would argue, firstly a moral cause. It was founded on liberal, broad church principles. It had links with the resistance movements in South Africa, but never became a left-only grouping. And I think those were some strengths when it came to arguing with different political parties and different governments. It was focused on one objective, and it didn't link with other broader related issues to a large extent, and this was probably a weakness, although it did link with some of the anti-colonial struggles of other South African countries. The Sports Boycott, and I was actually arrested in, I think it was 1969, and I spent the night in police custody when I was armed with a whistle in one hand and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in the other. And I made my way into a sports arena where the South African rugby team was playing. And as I put the whistle to my mouth, I was collared. So it goes back a long way. The sports and the Barclays Bank boycott. Barclays Bank is a big bank in the UK. And the movement against Barclays Bank did have an impact, even if it's only marginal. You know, if you're talking about 5 to 10% of people questioning their activities and withdrawing their accounts, that kind of thing had an impact. And they began to withdraw some of their activities. So that was very important in focusing attention. But the movement never gave up pressurizing mainstream political parties and institutions. Now we can argue about which is more important, militant street action or political pressure, but I'm just recording what the conclusions of the study by Roger Fieldhouse on the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. Roger Fieldhouse was an adult educator. He was the director of the Leeds University Department, to which I belonged for a while. So getting political support was hampered in the 1980s with the election of Thatcher and in the US with Reagan. Thatcher did not want to enforce economic boycotts. She colluded with Israel over getting arms to South Africa and generally resisted and denounced the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. But eventually she was forced to support the ending of apartheid and argued in the end with the South African government that Mandela, when he was freed, should be freed without conditions. Now this change of behaviour can be attributed to the public mood that the AAM, the anti-apartheid movement, established. So I would say anti-apartheid was successful. It had influence in South Africa, and my partner Jenny and I visited, was it last year or the year before, and we talked to a number of people who engaged in those struggles, and they said how important it was, even though the economic impact on them was quite significant. Just knowing that other countries were causing this difficulty for their government, not their government, but for the apartheid South African government, was comforting and supporting for them. Eventually, I would say, I'd have to say it took time. It wasn't, in fact, you could argue until 1994 that apartheid was actually formally ended in South Africa with the elections. Mandela was released and the ANC was unbanned in 1989. So that's a long period of time. And I have to warn those of you who are engaging in this struggle that it does take a long period of time, and I'm really pleased to see so many younger people because I've got a feeling I may not be here. I suspect the struggle against Israel apartheid is going to take an awful lot longer. I don't want to discourage anybody, but I think we have to be honest in a discussion of it. So we did connect this experience to the Israel Apartheid Week and the general campaign. We have to acknowledge that the major supporter and financial backer of Israel is the powerful USA. And until public opinion changes there, it will be an uphill struggle. Many African American and liberal politicians supported the South African anti-apartheid movement for some years, but it's important to remember that majority support did not swing behind the cause until very late. I recently heard an establishment US figure berating South African politicians for their failure to get behind the anti-terrorist activity and their criticism of Israel. The argument being that the US had got behind the struggle in South Africa. My response was, exactly what support was that again? Because that support didn't come through from mainstream USA until very, very late. Our struggle is in Canada, and it's almost as great as that south of the border, I have to say. We have a Prime Minister who defends Israel, and defends Israel right or wrong. I mean, I find that really problematic, because I don't even defend Canada right or wrong. I want to argue about whether Canada's actions are right before I have to support them. Supporting another country, right or wrong, is quite outrageous, I think. He referred to the Israeli attack on Lebanon as a measured response. You probably remember that?
Yes.
This measured response resulted in at least 1,000 civilians killed, and scattered thousands of cluster bombs across the towns and countryside. In fact, I noticed Robert Fisk, who's a very experienced journalist, actually put the number of bomb nuts that would result from the bombardment at least 1 million. And if you think that 3 to 5% of those don't actually explode when they hit the ground, but lay there until some child or somebody else picks it up or kicks it, then this killing will go on for a long time yet. And of course, the defense of the government of Israel's attack on Gaza, blaming it all on the rockets of the Gazans. I wrote a letter to the Journal explaining that in fact Hamas did not break the ceasefire order that was signed in June, that came into effect in July. I think it was July the 19th, in the summer, until November the 4th, when Israeli forces attacked Palestinians in Gaza. They abided by that ceasefire agreement, even though the Israelis never did lift the siege in accordance with the agreement they were supposed to do. Someone attacked me in the press saying that it was not true, that in fact Hamas had fired a rocket at Sadat. So I went back and I checked my sources, and I'm using the Israeli Intelligence and Terrorist Information Center, which is very close to Israeli defense forces. It works closely with them. And that's exactly what they said. They said Hamas not only did not fire any rockets, but they went to quite great lengths to prevent other groups from firing rockets as well. I also found that there was a woman, Naomi Sion, who lived in Sderot, the town to which the Hamas was supposed to have fired this rocket in breach of the agreement. And she, writing under the Not In My Name website, and she was a founder of the dialogue group, the idea of Palestinians and Israelis talking together. I'm going to stop there because you have other speakers, but my final thought is that we're going to have to mobilize and campaign, and I know that people involved with this are going to have to come out with a list of companies that we should target, a list of activities we should engage in, and we need to think very, very carefully about what we do and how we do it, and we should get in lots of supplies because it's going to take a long time. Thanks for listening.